Chapter 4.10, Part 1, Identity, Race, and Gender in Art. So we're going to look at some older works that have to do with these subjects, but what happened in the late 20th century, post-civil rights, the idea of where are women and people of color in the artwork that we see in the museums, that became more noticeable or more thought about. Now, remember, we have this historical procession that we watch Mesopotamia, and then we go to Greece and Rome and Egypt, and then we go further west into Europe. And artwork, the predominant art field, or the progression, if you want to call it that, historically goes into France and England and Italy, and to some degree Germany and other countries in Europe. Then at the World War II, around that time, a lot of people fleeing Hitler decide to come to New York City, and then New York becomes the hub of the art world. Now, even then in the mid-century, it's still predominantly white men from Europe. And as that happens, we're watching this painting evolve, we're watching sculpture evolve and architecture and so on. Over time, there began to become some questions. Of course, we had the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s in New York, and we have a few painters, African American painters and writers and so on, musicians, sort of emerge, and then they recede in World War II, and then we have civil rights post World War II in the late 50s, early 60s, emerging and onward. But there's kind of this push-pull of like a few things will start to happen and they sort of fade away. So once the later part of the 20th century, things really get cooking, people are noticing that a lot of the civil rights things that were implemented didn't really follow through. And we'll look at that through Spike Lee's work in the book and so on. But there was more of a call, if you will say, or more of a voice that there had to be some changes in museums. So in that case, we started to think about personal identity a little bit more. Not that it's the fault necessarily of the artists that were in the museum. And you have to remember with modernism, in the sense that, maybe some of them pushed other people out, but that's not really documented. But the idea with abstraction, and you're dealing with these big canvases of color, color field painting with Rothko and so on, the idea that personality didn't matter, that was kind of what the 50s abstract expressionists were about, if that makes sense. And then that shift into this personal identity is a big change in the 60s. So artists start to question these assumptions about identity and this less than unique, this one way of being that we're all striving to be, our artwork to be more of one particular type, and it starts to break apart. Before all this happens, or I would say what part of the feminist movement with the artwork, the Guerrilla Girls and some other people, part of the components, there was sort of a different, several-pronged approach in terms of feminism and painting and art. That one of them was that they're flicking through the history books and they realize there aren't any women in there. So that was one part of it, looking at museums, and we're thinking about New York here, really. All these giant museums, tons of artwork, there's no female names, there's no history of women painting. So it's doing some digging. They find that Artemisia Gentileschi, she was a really bona fide painter from the Baroque era. So we're in 1620. Remember that the Renaissance ends around 1600. So these paintings that she made were very emotional, very much of the style in the Baroque. And the subject here of Judith decapitating Holofernes, that's Holofernes, this would be Judith, and this is her maidservant, was depicted often in the Baroque. And she did this amazing rendition of this piece, very emotional, which we'll get into in a moment, And this was thought to have been Caravaggio's. Now, she was a Caravaggioist. Sorry, she was a follower of Caravaggio, and she really loved his chiaroscuro, which you see here, this blending and this rounding of the forms that make them really three-dimensional with the shadow and the light. So she really emulated his style. She had a painterly way of making it look somewhat like his work, so people mistakenly thought it was his work later in time. At any rate, we find Artemisia Gentileschi, and we sort of revisit her work and recontextualize it in the museum, and now it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy, and other places in the world. This one is the Detroit Institute of Arts in Michigan. So, backstory on her, this fits in two ways, where now we understand that there were women in history doing this amazing painting, and sometimes they were taking on a male identity just so that they could show their work. That happens too. But we're able to say, here's this woman who painted in this Baroque style, very legitimate painter, and she did exist in history. So on the personal note for her, what's going on here is she is depicting a biblical story, but she was also the victim of a rape, and this painting was done a little bit after that time, and a few unique things happened, or I wouldn't say unique, but rare. She was raped or assaulted by her painting instructor, and he was brought to trial. Those two things, being that she openly discussed it and that he was brought to trial, are surprising and rare. And the fact that he was sentenced for rape, that's also rare. So the hard thing for any woman of this era, and even this is somewhat true today, to come out and say, this is what happened to me. Many times the defense for the rapist will turn this person, the victim, into a horrible person and question their morality. So that was what she was risking. She went ahead and did it and was successful, and that she later remarried, which is also rare because there's a lot of perception that she was damaged goods in that era. But she did well. She went on and did many paintings, was successful, had several children, and lived a pretty strong life. So you can see her sense of rage here, realistically depicted. This is somewhat of a self-portrait. And you can see her anger and her willingness to deal the final blow to this man who has wronged her. So that's sort of the subtext. The subject of this painting, of course, is a biblical story, but you can see that a rage that she has on a personal level come through in the painting, and that's partly why it was so successful. Artists often use their personal experiences to embolden or to express more in the work, if that makes sense. This is later. This is typically shown another scene after the slaying. Holofernes' head is here, and then they try to figure out how to get rid of it and get rid of the evidence and that kind of thing. But much calmer scene 10 years on, or I guess we're about 5 years on. So it's a bit calmer of a scene. So this is a personal painting to her in some ways. She did 7 versions of this, and that first version was painted a year after the public trial of her attacker. And the second one that we were looking at there, and there were more than that, was slightly calmer, but you can see it was a popular theme at that time. She had she attracted some admiration for what she did and also the work itself. So self-portrait is the next thing we're going to look at, and we kind of think of that as somewhat self-portraiture with Artemisia Gentileschi. We do think about that a little bit, but this is a straight self-portrait we're going to see from Rembrandt. And the easy thing for artists is to really paint oneself, because all you need is a mirror and you can sit still and do the pose that you like. Chuck Close, who we looked at, he does a lot of self-portraits because you think about it, he's always available, and he takes his own breaks. You don't have to ask somebody if they're hungry and that kind of thing, so it's easier. But in some cases, it's more to do with wanting to talk about their experiences and sort of document their life. This is a self-portrait with Saskia in the scene of the prodigal son in 1635. Pardon, my cats are fighting. So he did many self-portraits through the years. So we watch him age. We watch his painting style change and develop over time. So over a 40-year period, yeah. So there's 90 self-portraits, and he takes on many guises, many different themes. And remember, we looked at Gentileschi. She's Judith in one, and she could be something else in another. So this is similar with Rembrandt. He takes over this idea of the prodigal son, and this is actually his wife, Saskia. Van Gogh, we know, did several self-portraits, and in this one, he's so honest. I think that's why we love Van Gogh so much, is that this is him with his bandaged ear after he had cut it off. I mean, a lot of people would think, okay, I don't want to tell that story. I want to hide the fact that this thing happened. I want to move away from this emotional experience. And Van Gogh just goes right into it. And we love his emotional brushstrokes. You can just see all those layers of paint and get up close to this work. It's just so gorgeous. This one's in a private collection, but there are many that you can see in museums all over the world, and they're just so exquisite and emotional. So he was living in the south of France, argument with Gauguin. He really thought in Arles, France, which is the south of France, beautiful city, he thought that they were going to have this sort of like painting commune, and of course he wasn't mentally well, and he put too much on that, and I think it pushed Gauguin away, and then so he cut off his ear, and he showed it to a prostitute. I believe that they were both sharing. So you see kind of these nervous lines and contrasting colors. It's very bold.